Grace Stuart, what do people get wrong about domestic violence?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things they get wrong is that there's a lot of confusion involved, right? A lot of domestic violence is the victim feeling very confused, that cognitive dissonance, and we hear that term a lot. But they think that it's, of course, easy to just leave, which is a big reason I started my podcast to show why it's not easy to just simply leave. But just the fact that there's so much confusion involved. They're having so many ruminating thoughts constantly, especially after leaving. And it's so much of that mental game that's being caused by the abuser that the victim's dealing with every single day. Where does this begin? Where does this end? They're dealing with all these thought patterns that are very difficult. So that's one of them.
Right. And they say part of the trauma bond is when you're very confused about what's going on. You don't know up from down. But the one thing you do know is it's all your fault. And I think that's a Dr. Jennifer Gardella quote. But was that your experience with it too?
It was. And I think that ties into another thing people get wrong. We have to realize the victim really believes that it's their fault. It's such a deep belief when you're going through it that all you know is it's all your fault, like you said. And they really feel that. I mean, it's just such a stronghold on them that I almost try to prove to them why that's not the case. Like, let's take that thought loop that you're going through over and over again every single day, and let me prove to you why it's not your fault and why, it's very hard to be dealing with those ruminating thoughts.
That is a huge one with the ruminating thoughts. How did you start to learn and really understand it wasn't your fault?
It was a long, long journey. Probably, I mean, we were together for about 5 years when I was in my domestic violence situation. But I think one of the big ways I started to realize it wasn't my fault was starting to organize in my mind, okay, what was the reality of what was really happening on a day to day basis? So I talk a lot about documenting things and making lists of what was going on. I call it your reality list. And what that is you're having something to look back on to say what was going on a regular basis so that each time that thought comes in, oh, it was all my fault, and that's all I know, you can replace it with a piece of truth that, okay, let me look back and see what my life was actually like, and you can get back on track.
Sure. And what are the parts of it that make it really difficult to see that it's not all your fault? Because I think one thing that happens to people is people who don't understand it, they think it's black and white. Oh, of course, it's just all bad. And of course, should just leave. But the reality, it's a lot more sticky than that. There's a lot more moving parts. But what are some of those moving parts that kind of make it really confusing?
I think some of the really confusing things are that cause and effect starts to get switched around when you're going through the cycle with them. So, again, you start to believe it's more your fault, but what's really going on is maybe as you're reacting to the abuse, the more that happens, you start to think, well, I guess I was starting to pull away emotionally from the person,
Mhm.
or I guess I was starting to try to get out of the situation. And maybe that's what they picked up on. And that's why they lost control or lashed out at me. And so cause and effect starts to switch. And again, it really makes sense to the victim. They think, well, I did say that hurtful thing, or I did start to pull away again. And so they're like, maybe I'm the one hurting them. Maybe. And it really makes sense to them. That's the thing we miss is for the victim, everything starts to align in their mind of, okay, well, I don't know where this is even coming from. Right. Those thought loops are like just in a big knot in their brain.
Right. And that's where Darvo comes from: deny, accuse, reverse victim and offender. That is, they live and breathe Darvo.
They do. They do. And so that's one of the biggest things. A lot of times when I'm speaking about domestic violence or even doing my podcast, I'm thinking of the person who's driving in their car, just dissociating, dealing with those ruminating thoughts, dealing with the thoughts they're just blanking out and thinking, all I know is this is all my fault. And they're going through those thoughts over and over again. And what happens is each thing that they remember from the relationship that they think was their fault, there's like no end to that thought. They never feel satisfied with this closure to it of, okay, this is why it's not my fault. When they're dealing with those thoughts, a lot of times after leaving, when they're going through that withdrawal phase, they can't figure out where it begins and ends. They can't figure out why the abuser did what they did, why they might have reacted, where this is all coming from. And
Right.
so I think of that person who's sitting alone. Maybe they've just left their abuser and they're like just constantly suffering through those thought trains.
Right.
That's
And
a
I
lot of
think,
what it is.
yeah, and I think the part that really gets tricky for people is they take something that it's a little bit of truth and then they twist it and distort it. And that little
Yes.
bit of truth is something that makes it really tricky and really difficult to kind of pick up on. And unless you have a really strong belief in your own reality, which is one of the first things abusers and narcissists, and they tear that down from people. They get people to question their perception of reality so that they'll weaponize things in that way. Oh, that little thing you did, that means it was all your fault. And that means you're unloving. And that means you're uncaring. And that means I'm the victim, is what they'll say.
Right. And a lot of times people think it's going to look exactly a certain way, that they're going to say the exact phrases that you hear on social media. They're going to say these exact, and a lot of times they do. A lot of times they're all very much the same. But at the same time, when you're in that cycle with them, and it's just like a washing machine, uh, when you're living in it day to day, it's not always happening exactly the way you think it will. A lot of people are faced with even a very self aware kind of abuser where it might be a fake kind of self awareness, possibly, but they're dealing with those apologies from them, the future faking, the promise making, which is all very typical. But a lot of times they can seem very sincere, they can
Right.
seem very genuine. And so that's a lot of the problems we're dealing with is sometimes even that seemingly genuineness from them. That's what trips us up, that kind of stuff.
So you have me thinking now to go back to the beginning of this. What was this guy like in the beginning? Like, what first initially attracted you to him?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, first of all, in my story, there was definitely a lot of turbulent stuff from the beginning. There was a lot of, this probably isn't a good situation. I'm pretty honest with that because a lot of people who do get into these situations, there are some things from the beginning that
Sure.
they're like, why didn't I see that? And so I'm very honest with that he suffered with addiction issues. And I knew that from an early point. But sometimes when those things are incorporated in the cycle of abuse, you think, well, if they'll just stay sober, if they'll just be successful in this one area, then they would be perfect. Then that you think that the real them is just underneath that surface,
Mm,
kind of waiting to blossom. But from the start, he was super charming, just like very loved by a lot of people, very likable. Just that very much that outer personality that could like really draw people in a room, the person you wanted to be with. Um, so they make you feel very lucky to be with them instead of the other way around. And
mm,
of course, that probably came from certain things within myself. I was very young at the time. So there were a lot of factors that played in. It was a big age gap relationship. So I think that played a role as well. But overall, you just get drawn in by them.
right.
The trauma bond is it feels good at first. It feels
Sure.
great. They got that love bombing and just sucks you right in.
And I guess did he feel like home to you? I don't know what your upbringing was like, but was it similar to that in a way?
So I had a pretty stable upbringing. There's a misconception that if you fall into this, there will be these specific things in your life that happen beforehand, or it can be anyone. I mean, anything is possible. I think I would say, oh, he certainly felt like home the more we got into the relationship. There was that double sided part to it where he was my best friend and my abuser.
Mm,
So they're your abuser and your rescuer. They're your
yeah.
nightmare, but they're also like your best friend at the same time. So when I say it felt like home, there were very long time periods in between the worst incidents that felt very comfortable, very peaceful. And that's what'll trip you up is thinking, well, he was good for several months at a time. Things were great. He was good for even, I think, like 6 months at one point. It was pretty good. Now things were showing through the cracks, but those good phases are just as much a part of the cycle as the
Right.
bad ones most of the
And
time.
that's what Lundy Bancroft says in the Why Did He Do That book,
Mm-hmm.
that they all seem to have good days too. And it's
Yeah.
not just all bad, but they can string together a lot of good days. And I think one thing he says in there is they build their case in the good days, where they take mental notes of things, where they'll say, oh, she said that I didn't like. She did this that I didn't like. And then all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, they will hurl all of these accusations at you, like, you did that, 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 that. But they were building this case up
Yeah.
during the quote unquote good times. And that's part of the cycle.
Yeah. And I'm like a diehard Lundy person. I pretty much base everything I teach and most things come from there because it's such a baseline. It was such a baseline for me in my journey when I read that book, and that's why I recommend it to people. I just think it's such a baseline for the way I view abuse, and I think that's really interesting what you said because I think sometimes not everything's necessarily premeditated by the abuser. Not every little thing is planned out and premeditated, but it's that abusive nature that's always operating. It's that nature. It comes from like their attitudes, their entitlement, their belief system, their values. Like it's very much the core of who they are,
Right.
is the way I see it. And so that's another place people get tripped up, which is, well, is the abuser planning this out? Like, I really don't think they just sat down and thought of this plan to gaslight me and what they were going to say. Like, no, it's not always that they're premeditating it, right? But that doesn't mean that they're not abusing you. That doesn't
Right.
mean it's not domestic violence. It's that abusive nature that's always running under the surface. And you can also call it coercive control, where there might not be as overt things happening, but right there's that control going on under the surface. So,
Right. And I think, sometimes things could be premeditated,
oh,
and then
yeah,
other
for
times,
sure.
like, certainly not. Sometimes I think it might just be second nature to them to do some of these
Exactly.
abusive tactics.
Yeah, and there were things in my story that were premeditated. So that can certainly happen. But there were a lot of things that were just the way he was operating at all times.
Right.
So,
And I think the other important thing you mentioned is you did notice a couple things that were a little iffy in the beginning. Overwhelmingly, that is mostly what I hear, is that people did see a couple things, but
okay.
they think it's going to be, oh, like you said, if only they get better with this addiction, then everything will be better on the other side of that. And
Yeah.
it reminds me of when people longer into a relationship, they'll think, oh, if only things went back to how it was in the beginning, or if only they would change and do better with this one thing, everything would be better. But
Yeah.
I
And I'm
go on.
sorry. That's one of the most painful parts that I'm seeing for people is they're convinced that it's just a bad relationship dynamic and that if they just get the communication back on track or they just fix a couple things on their end, that the abuse won't happen anymore. And that's a very painful thing to feel because you feel like you hold some of the control in a way. Like, well, if I would just change whatever they're telling me I'm at fault for, then this would stop. And it's like, no, it's not about bad relationship dynamics. It's not simply just toxic. Like it's on purpose by the perpetrator. It's they're the only one to blame, is what I'm
Right.
saying.